Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy at El Paso Community College.
My name is Jules Simon, and I teach philosophy at the University of Texas, El Paso. And for this season, we've been studying the fronteras between philosophy and different disciplines, and today we're looking at the frontera, or the border between philosophy and psychology. And our guest is Dr. Tina Gupta. Tina studied sociology and psychology at the University of Colorado Boulder. After earning a Bachelor of Arts, she went on to attend a PhD program in clinical psychology at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. There, she researched emotional processes in individuals at risk for developing psychotic disorders. Tina also received clinical training in applying behavioral interventions such as cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy to those experiencing a range of mental health challenges. As a clinician, she works with clients to build awareness, develop skills, and clarify values. Tina received her PhD from Northwestern University this year and is continuing her research and clinical training as a Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where she studies positive emotions in those at risk for developing severe mental illness.
So, Dr. Gupta, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And you know, our first question that we'd like to begin with is, you do clinical psychology. Could you please tell us the difference between psychology and clinical psychology?
You know, psychology in general, because it's a big field, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So psychology is a very, very large field that has many different types of subfields. So when we talk about psychology, it really is the study of behaviors. And psychology can be broken up into animal research. There's also human research. The clinical piece really does focus on human thoughts, emotions, and behaviors and when they go awry. So in my field, specifically clinical psychology, we're really working to understand different types of clinical disorders and diagnoses and when psychological processes aren't really helpful for an individual. But there's other types of psychology as well. So there's social psychology, which is the study of social behaviors and interactions. There's also cognitive psychology, which is the study of different types of thought processes. So for example, someone that's a cognitive psychologist might study perception or memory. There's personality psychology as well, which is all about, as you can imagine, the study of personality, how personality develops, how it manifests, how personality might, in terms of the traits, might not be useful for an individual's life. So a really, really large field.
And then to follow up, I would like to ask you, what drew you to clinical psychology?
So I think my answer to that is in regards to the research that I fell into. So I actually fell into clinical psychology after I graduated from the University of Colorado Boulder. And the research I was working on at that time was working with individuals at risk for developing different types of psychotic disorders. And I think for me, I was really interested in how psychology or psychological disorders don't necessarily emerge overnight, but instead develop through a series of events and interactions over time. And I think also too, what was interesting is that psychological disorders don't necessarily always emerge, even if someone's at risk. And a model that was really intriguing to me is the diathesis stress model, which is a really central model in my area specifically, which suggests that there's this interaction between what's called acquired vulnerability. So for example, exposure, a mother, being exposed to toxins, so prenatal insults, interacting with genetic vulnerability, and that creating a constitutional vulnerability, meaning a diathesis, a vulnerability that an individual can carry their whole life. And then that vulnerability can interact with neuromaturational processes, so brain development, essentially. It can interact with stress, so psychosocial stressors, environmental stressors like exposure to trauma or exposure to systemic racism. And those together can contribute to the expression or not expressing a specific disorder, in this case, psychosis. So I think for me, clinical psychology is really interesting because we can take that broad developmental approach and understand how we can prevent different types of disorders, again, in my specific risk area.
So can I follow up with that a little bit, Tina?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So it's this relationship between the individual, the organic human individual, right, and their environment. So there's stress factors like, losing a job or a racial bias incident or something like that, right? And so that, at least how I understood you, triggers what may have already been a predisposition to not be able to handle some kind of stress factor, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the accumulation also too of stressful events. So maybe there's one stressful event like losing a job, but then there's other stressful events on top of that, like exposure to trauma. All of that can absolutely trigger the emergence of in this case, psychosis, which is what I research. But it's also too interesting to look at why is it that some people might develop these disorders, and why do some people with that same predisposition that you mentioned, why don't those people develop the disorder? What's protecting them? What's keeping them resilient? What's keeping them?
What do you, in your research, what is your finding?
It's a lot of different factors, things like there's definitely not one answer that keeps an individual from developing psychosis in my research, but definitely a lot of different factors that interact. So having access to care, being able to have the awareness that an individual's life is not really functioning in the way that perhaps someone without a disorder or someone without that risk disposition could be functioning, and being able to access resources, having family support in place, being able to bounce back when, let's say, there is a traumatic event, being able to seek resources and support pretty close to after the event, being able to, we talk a lot about early identification. So the individual, there's things that protect them, but also there's systemically or structurally things that we need to do as a society to help individuals seek those services. So in my area, for example, in those that are at risk for psychosis, we do a lot of community outreach and education as to what being at risk for psychosis looks like, and educating different types of community members on the types of symptoms. For example, if an individual is seeing shadows in the corner of their eye, or they're hearing whispers, those are signs. And we want to be able to educate clinicians to look out for those signs so that they can intervene if they have a client, for example, exhibiting those types of experiences.
I
have a related question.
Okay.
That just popped into my mind
Sure.
just now as you were talking. And, so there's all these external stress factors that can contribute, like, or these external events that can contribute, like the loss of a job or getting divorced, or, some traumatic event, like
war
or weather event, getting flooded or something like that. All that can contribute to triggering some kind of psychoses. So, but I'm thinking here of something more prevalent, and that we're jumping way ahead in our list of questions, right? But wouldn't it be fair to say that those individuals who make their way into schools or wherever and do these mass shootings are suffering from some kind of psychotic event, that they're predisposed, and their environment then triggers them to act out in this way? And would we describe that as a psychotic event? I mean, it's really hard then to categorize something like that, right?
Yeah, and it's actually a really, in the context of violence and mass shooting and the interactions with mental health is a really interesting area. And I think it's one that is misunderstood. So, for example, it's more likely for someone diagnosed with schizophrenia to be a danger to themselves than other people. And I think we as a society, when things happen that we don't understand, we want to be able to quickly say, hey, that's due to mental illness. That's, due to those mental, psychological, that crazy person that has schizophrenia. When the research actually doesn't necessarily support that. Perhaps it's a factor that might be contributing to violence, but there are lots of other factors too that can contribute to someone going on and engaging in violent behaviors or behaviors that are not accepted, in our society, of course.
Yeah, I can imagine that it might not be classified or categorized as a psychotic event or something like that, because it could be that this is how this person grew up in their household, with these kind of embedded stereotypes just drilled into them day after day after day, and then leads them to, gradually leads them to some kind of violent outburst or something like that.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that would happen. But that's not the kind of clientele you work with, right?
Nope, that's not. So I work with a range of individuals, adolescents, young adults, older adults that experience a lot of different types of psychological processes like depressive mood, anxious mood, and my research as well as my clinical work is also focused in those at risk for psychosis. Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm going to follow up with this question now to bring it back to question number 2. In my mind, when I think of a clinical psychologist, I think of somebody sitting like in a leather chair next to a couch and somebody laying down on the couch and the clinical psychologist taking notes. Is that what you do? What's your average work day? What does a researcher and clinical psychologist do on their average work day?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I really like about clinical psychology is that there's so much you can do as a clinical psychologist. So you can do assessments for diagnosis. You can do clinical work only, meaning working with clients one-on-one or families or working with couples and applying different types of interventions and therapies. You can just do research. You can go into industry and work for different companies and help develop apps or whatever that company does that's useful, or help with the dynamics within the company, teaching. For me right now, and I think this is going to morph and evolve over time, but my focus right now is doing assessments, so diagnostic assessments, asking lots of questions to a family or an individual as to what their thoughts and their emotions and their experiences are like. I also do clinical work. So I do therapy, one-on-one therapy with different types of individuals, and research as well.
What's your favorite activity, or do you have a couple of favorite activities? Do you like doing the assessment part? Do you like digging in and research and finding out what other people are saying about it? Or do you like working like one-on-one, face-to-face? Do you have a favorite aspect of your workday?
Yeah, because I wear so many different hats, I think it's each piece has a favorite to it. So assessment, I like, being able to unravel what's actually presented. So when someone has lots of symptoms, being able to kind of understand, okay, what are we seeing here? And being able to recommend services that might make sense for a particular issue. With clinical work, I like understanding, and keeping in mind the idea that one-on-one, when I'm doing therapy with clients, each individual shows up with a life history and experiences and a narrative, and being able to ask questions, which I believe is one of the most useful tools I have as a clinician, to ask questions so I can understand that person. And then research, I really find it meaningful to, I think my favorite part of research is doing research that has that clinical application. So not just necessarily sitting behind a computer and running statistics, which I do a lot of stats, but being able to ask research questions that might be able to inform the way that we conduct interventions and think about the etiology of different types of processes or disorders.
So I imagine with each of those aspects, there's probably some challenge or difficulty. So could you tell us some of the challenges with, say, doing diagnoses or the Do you run up against brick walls when you're doing the research, or do you have trouble getting clients to talk with you or to let you into their interior, to their psyche or something like that? Like what are the challenges that you get faced with?
So many challenges. And I think, especially clinically, being able to recognize that there's challenges and then model, that you can think through challenges, model being sort of showing by virtue when the client isn't or is in the room with you, showing that you can, get over those challenges and sort of conquer those challenges can be really useful. But I think for me, in terms of, the assessment piece, each person is so different. And I think that's a really important piece of clinical work that can sometimes get lost, is that no individual will come in and say, these are my symptoms. These are my 5 symptoms I have. It's every person is so different and presents clinically in unique ways. And so being able to take the information that we get, which sometimes is hard to get, sometimes, as you gave that example, it can be really overwhelming, and it can be really intimidating for someone going into an assessment or to therapy for the first time or even the 10th time, to feel comfortable and to really feel like they're in a place that feels safe and they feel accepted. And it can be challenging to build that, what we call rapport, that relationship and that sense of comfort. And that can take time. And I think that's also one of the things I really love, is being able to formulate that relationship with clients, whether it's with an assessment or with clinical work, despite it being, a challenge as well. And then research, I think research is really interesting because I said, I really do love the translational application and the clinical application of the research I do. And at the same time, it is hard to translate research into public policy. And I think we as a field really recognize that there are barriers to that. And, it takes a long time to put results out there and disseminate the results in the community and really see action when we put research out there. And it happens, and, we have so many people on different levels doing their parts, but it's definitely not an easy task. And I think that can be challenging at times too, to sort of accept that it's a process that doesn't happen overnight, but one that takes time and a lot of effort and resources as well.
And I will follow up with the next question. So you talked about the challenges of being a clinical psychologist. What makes it worth it for you?
Yeah, I think, it's a really meaningful work. I think it's, there's so many situations and people I've worked with and groups that I've led that involve teaching skills and helping to work through challenges where, I've seen a lot of change and people wanting to come in and feeling really motivated and eager and excited to learn new skills to improve their life and identify values that will help them, move toward, identify areas that they can change in their life to make them move towards their values. So I think seeing change and seeing progress is definitely what keeps me going in this field, even though it can be really hard. And I think the research too, the research informs the clinical work and the clinical work informs the research. And I think that combination is really helpful and keeps the meaning of the work that you do at the forefront.
As an undergrad, when I would tell people my major, and they would be like, okay, well, what's your major, right? I'd say philosophy. Then inevitably people would be like, yeah, my cousin majored in psychology. And so philosophy and psychology are often, it's like they're cousins, and sometimes they get confused for each other. And our show, we talk about the borders, right? La frontera between different areas. So what, in your opinion, is the difference between what is similar, what is different? How are they the same and different, philosophy and psychology?
Insofar as you've studied philosophy, coming from philosophers, right? So we
Right.
haven't studied as much psychology as you have. You most likely have not studied as much philosophy as us, but from your perspective, what do you think is the relationship or the differences or the similarities or what?
I would love to get your thoughts on this as well, being on the philosophy side of it, but sort of from my training and my perspective, psychology did branch out of philosophy. So there's a lot of terminology and sort of foundation that psychology borrows from philosophy. So for example, I think about examples like perception or phenomenology or dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a therapy that draws on the idea of opposing forces and helping clients to notice opposing forces and bringing them together and being able to hold both. Mindfulness, so being able to develop and build awareness. And I think that's those terms, those ideas we do really share as fields. Again, would love your thoughts on this. And at the same time, I think in psychology, we focus a lot on thoughts, emotions, and behaviors specifically. So how can we use these terms in order to look at the interactions between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors and work towards pushing people towards, being in line with their values in their life. And I think a lot of the clinical research that happens, there's that translational application. So we might develop studies to look at whether mindfulness is effective in individuals with depressive disorders, those types of research questions. I perhaps could see that as maybe a difference between philosophy and psychology, but would love to hear what you think as well, because I think it's a very interesting question.
What do you think is the difference?
I've got a lot of questions for you, Tina. So, so in philosophy, we study ideas and words and emotions.
Yeah.
Similarly, and behavior and actions as well, right? So, and the image of the psychologist sitting by the in a leather chair by the bedside is what comes to mind here again for me, is right. So does the psychologist, the clinical psychologist, when you're talking with someone, are you taking down like copious notes, or do you have like a recording device where you're listening to the person talking and then you analyze the talk later? We analyze students' thoughts by reading their papers. Or seeing what they say on a quiz or an exam, right? So we understand their words or their ideas and their language by what they convey to us, right?
Right.
So similarly, you have that kind of relationship as a clinician, right? You have somebody that you're relating to, and they have to talk with you or communicate with you somehow, right?
Right.
So are you like recording them, or are you not allowed to do that, or
it's a great question. So it varies quite a bit. So I think some people, they feel comfortable, clinicians will go in with a piece of paper or a notebook and take notes as a client talks. As a trainee, you tend to have your sessions recorded, your therapy sessions. So that's more for supervision purposes. So it really is context dependent. And the way that I have approached this is, aside from the videos being sometimes useful for supervision, is I try not to take notes. And, sometimes for a client, being able, like seeing, a clinician walk into the room with a clipboard or a notepad can feel really comfortable for them. And perhaps in a clinical setting, bringing up a conversation around, hey, what would it be like if I took notes? What do you think about that? What would that, do you think that would affect, our conversation? But for me, I kind of just try to be in the moment, because I think that is an important goal of clinical work is, as a clinician, you show up and you really want to try to be, at least from my perspective, with the client, really present with the client. And sometimes having a notepad can create a barrier from being able to be with the client as they go on this journey of trying to figure out whatever it is they're trying to figure out, or to just process emotion with them, or whatever it may be that's presented in the room.
Yeah, historically, psychology broke off from philosophy, I want to say like in the late 1800s. William James is one of the figures that gets credited with
the founding of the field.
But I've read a little bit of Albert Ellis, and he read the Stoics, and he read Kant, and he read Spinoza. So even back to the Stoics, who were, pre-Christian philosophers, they also differentiated between our thoughts, our emotions, our body, which was many years, I don't know how many years, 1,500 years or so before Descartes. Descartes was the one that dichotomized the body and the mind, as being two different substances. Philosophers have been wondering, how can we live in a way that we're going to be happy and we're not going to be neurotic, to be more happy and less neurotic. So we've been trying to figure that out. But I think with psychology, from my perspective, is at that time, the scientific method was already well in place. And so then I think philosophers were able to, who wanted to know about the mind, were able to go a more scientific route and then study like you do, right? Behavior, emotions, thoughts, more systematically, because now you had a method and that you could try to replicate, and see and run studies and then see how far, whether your theories, how they panned out. And I think before that we were just speculating, or we observed, human behavior, but we didn't run the experiments like psychologists do these days. It was more because it was still out of observation. Look, like when you're worried about trying to control other people, that's what drives you crazy. So, it's like, so they were still, they were experimenting, but not as systematically as psychologists do. I think that is the difference from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to think about too. We have a lot of conversations in the research component of clinical psychology of how do we measure, things like, I know you gave the worry example. How do you measure worry? And how do we measure the experience of emotions? How do we operationalize that to be able to test some of these theories? And that is a big portion of what we do from the research side, and being able to develop measures, validate measures that really do tap into those specific types of experiences. So there's a lot of borrowing these theories, taking these theories, and then absolutely really trying to test them to see if they work or if they don't work. And if they don't work, being able to refine those methods and the research question in and of itself to see if we can improve the way that we, in this case, implement different interventions.
I think it's really cool because, like, the Buddha, I don't know how many years ago, thousands of years ago, right, figured some things out about happiness and awareness, right? But now we have the tools to put the electrodes in people's on people's brains and then measure the electrical activity of their brain waves and what parts of the brain lights up and doesn't.
What you introduced there is a technological dimension.
The tools and the method.
The technological stuff. But so that's one area that's really complex. Using these kinds of tools, these kinds of extensions of our perception and extensions of our observation to more closely monitor changes in the body's and the mind's the brain's behavior, right? I'm aware of is that there are the ways that one judges the success of a patient and a clinician relationship is the extent to which the clinician was able to have an effect on the patient. And so the patient has to get attached some way to the clinician. They have to develop trust. You have to get this, inside their head, so to speak, right? And so I know you're really just beginning, kind of. You're just beginning in your practice, and you're recent PhD graduate, and you're starting your postdoc studies. You've been seeing people along, but do you find something like that already happening in your own practice, that you have these relationships with your clients that are intense?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it depends on the client and the individual, but absolutely. And I think some of the best therapy, again, this is my opinion, but I think some of the best therapy is done when the alliance is really strong. And a strong alliance, includes, like you mentioned, trust and being able to, as a clinician, create an environment where there isn't judgment. And I think when we become judgmental as clinicians, that's when there's a lot of red flags that can happen. And it can create like a rupture, which means with the client, the alliance breaks down, and being able to heal that alliance can actually make the alliance stronger in time. But sometimes when we approach situations like, becoming judgmental or approaching something judgmentally as a clinician, that rupture might be so strong that someone might not come back to therapy as a result. So I do think the alliance is just so incredibly important. And I've seen that, just again, being with that patient or a client with that strong relationship as kind of the guide in our work. I think that's been really important. And I see that as really effective in some of my work with clients.
So how do you do it, right? Because on one hand, you don't want to come off as judgmental,
right,
but at the same time, there is observation and judgment. Insofar as you're trying to meet them where they're at, but move them towards something that's more helpful. So you're still assessing and you're still judging, even if you're not outwardly displaying, I can't believe you just said that, or something like that, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Can I just twist that a little bit? So it seems like, what Kim is getting at is that you as a clinician have to always be kind of self-regulating yourself to make sure you're not stepping over the line to make a judgment that's going to damage the relationship or something like that.
Well, and not word judgment.
Yeah, we're human, it's impossible to be free of judgment. And I think one of the really important components of clinical work is that we have supervision, which means you might have, another clinician that's helping you with challenges with your clients, or there's consultation. So you might meet with other therapists to talk about difficulties. And when those judgments come up, because they inevitably will. That's part of being a human, being able to recognize, I'm noticing I'm having a judgment about this client right now, and taking that to consultation or taking that to supervision and being able to talk about it with other people that are practicing in the field and figure out how to overcome that judgment. And if a clinician can't overcome that judgment, being able to say, maybe this isn't the best fit, or it isn't the best interest for the client for me to be able to get over this judgment. I can't. So perhaps them working with someone else makes sense here.
I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's similar to what we do as teachers, because we have a sense for where the student is at, and we know that we want them to come along further, but we withhold our judgment until the last assessment, right? The exit assessment. But yeah, and so how we perceive the students affects how we behave towards them.
Right.
So then, yeah, it is. And so we want to withhold that judgment as much as possible. But at the same time, there is this assessment that's going on throughout so that we can move them along a little further. And
Absolutely.
do you have more follow-up questions or more comments?
Where were you going to go now?
Well, I was going to go towards mental health because
Can I then,
sure.
Can you just pause there for
Yeah.
a moment? So since we're on this border between philosophy and psychology, you know I work in phenomenology, right?
Right.
But phenomenology is not just restricted to philosophy. I mean, the health sciences, psychology in particular, makes use of phenomenology. And it struck me as you were describing your practice in a clinic of not trusting your judgment and seeking the advice of your peers and others who are in the practice with you to get their opinion. And that's very similar to what happens in phenomenological research, because you start off, it's supposed to be a method where you enter into attempts to describe something, some kind of psychosis perhaps, or an event, right, without presuppositions, right? So there's the first attempt to do it, just to describe it in whatever language you have. But then necessarily, this is why I said you always have to be self-regulating and kind of aware of your own subjective ego and what you're bringing into the task, right?
Absolutely.
Then you have to check yourself and say, well, this is as far as I can get, and maybe my colleague here can then shed some light on this particular case, right? And then you turn to research. If it's not your colleague, then there's paper or this book that, as a trained clinician, you've become familiar with, so you can turn to them and look for help, right? Am I on the right track here?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the point I want to highlight too is that when working with individuals with all sorts of mental health challenges, you're not on an island alone. It really is so collaborative, and it's important, and in some ways our duty as clinicians to be able to consult with other people, especially when we're stuck, and maybe judgment is contributing to us feeling stuck. So absolutely. And the one thing too I wanted to make sure to mention is that sometimes judgments can be really useful. So if I'm having a reaction to a behavior that a client is showing in the room in our therapy session, that might be a sign that perhaps this behavior is showing up outside of the room in an individual's life in other domains. So that's really informative, and that can be really useful. And if the alliance is strong, there might be opportunities to really use the reactions and the judgments perhaps that I'm noticing as a clinician and bring it up with the client, definitely in a skillful, thoughtful, effective way, of course, but a judgment doesn't necessarily mean, okay, I can't bring that up because I'm having this reaction. Right. Perhaps after consultation and getting support from your supervisor or other people in the field with how to think about this and work through that judgment, this could be a mini intervention for a behavior that's translating into the broader environment for that person.
Oh, that's great.
How do you all define mental health?
Yeah, let's go to mental health.
Yeah, it's a big question. So I think, definitely different orientations would have different ways to define it. But I think one that comes to mind for me is psychological well-being, essentially. And, when we talk about being able to care for our mental health and, being able to do certain things to improve our mental health, it's the way I see it is to improve our well-being, our psychological well-being.
What does that look like? Is it somebody, how does somebody who has good mental health, like somebody who's physically fit, I imagine, they're fit, they can run, they can probably do pull-ups or swim. I don't know, they're fit, right? So how about mental health? What does somebody who's got good mental health, how do they behave?
Someone that's functioning in their life effectively. So they're working towards their goals. Let's say someone's goal is to, become a doctor, and that's really important to them. They're able to get up in the morning, eat their breakfast, get out of the door, and be able to engage with their environment in a way where perhaps their mood is regulated, they're achieving their goals, they're completing the tasks that they want to be completing, they're engaging socially. So they're functioning in a way that allows them to engage with their environment in a way that we as society would consider as well-being, as effective. So a lot of these, I think, constructs in mental health too are also, they're created by society. So we have an expectation of what someone that has a high level of psychological functioning or good mental health or good well-being, what that looks like. And so sometimes we use that as a baseline to decide what is good and what is bad. And I'm going to put quotes around those because those are judgments. And from a psychological perspective, we move away and we step away from terminology like good and bad. But I think
you go beyond good and evil. I'm working on Nietzsche right now.
You're what? What was that?
Working on Nietzsche's philosophy.
Oh, yes.
So I've got the book title in my mind, Beyond Good and Evil. So we suspend value judgments. It's an important point because the value judgments come from our social acculturation, right?
I wanna talk about Aristotle at that time, 2,500 years ago or so. He had this, well, not just he, right, but the Greeks had the word eudaimonia. So you means good, like you carry it, right? And daemon means demon, but it just means
your
like
life spirit,
your soul.
Yeah.
And so it's like somebody who's happy. Eudaimon, somebody who's happy. A eudaimon is happy. Eudaimonia is happiness, but back then happiness was flourishing throughout your whole lifetime. So not just like, oh, I won the lottery and I'm happy, right? Or, oh, I got a raise.
On this track, let me talk about this because this is an important thing. As you were speaking, Tina, I was thinking, how do you predict or how do you identify good mental health or what constitutes eudaimonia or something like that? And I was thinking of, you're familiar with these blue zones, right? Where there's a certain places in the world where people live over 100, right? One in Japan, one in southwest United States, and I forget where the other ones are. One's in the Mediterranean.
Okinawa, I think.
Yeah, it's in Okinawa, right? Yeah. But these people live in that community. There's more people in that community that live to be in their hundreds than other places in the world. So they're happy and flourishing, right?
Throughout
supposedly.
their whole lifetime.
Their whole lifetime, right. And so there's some things that are characteristic of that. One is well-functioning, right? But what it means to be well-functioning is they have meaningful activities, or you mentioned purpose before, right? Purposeful activities, right? They have a good, not overwhelming, but good social relations. They get together with people and meet and have drinks, or they have tea, or they go out for coffee and cakes like that. And they do physical exercise. Like they go for walks and they do gardening and things like that. So then the question came up in my mind as I'm listening to you and Kim, can you say that someone who, say, sometime in their life, maybe they even got to be their mid-60s like me, have they had a good, healthy mental life, a flourishing life, if that person commits suicide? I mean, this is the punctuation at the end, right?
Yeah.
There's these underlying things, right?
Well, Tina thinks about that when I'm going to finish my thought.
Oh, sorry.
And my thought was, so, before we talked about mental health now, philosophers have been thinking about what do you need to do in order to be happy, as a human being. And Aristotle focused on ethics, on being an ethical person, because he thought, like, if you are generous and a good friend and, honest, these are character traits, behavior, right? Choices you're making, which translates into a habit, which translates into a character, a way of being. And so certain dispositions are going to have a better chance at experiencing eudaimonia. But he took into account not just, so for him being happy meant also yeah, how do you deal with the setbacks, right? How do you deal with, and you talked about resilience earlier. So, does it mean that flourishing, does that mean that it's always sunny and you're always skipping down the street? No, it means that you're a human being and you experience all the range of emotions.
All of them.
You
right?
know, like you don't, it's not like you never get angry or you never get sad. So
But,
I guess.
but my question's related though,
Well-
because my question has to do with the resilience part, right?
Well, I'm not sure what your question has to deal with, but I'm trying to ask mine.
Well,
And that
and
is, yes.
I was going to mention too, I think, it's such an interesting question too, to think about happiness in our society. We have a society where there's this rhetoric of everyone needs to be happy and you need to do what you can to be happy. Well, why can't we just be content? And so there's that piece that comes to mind to the conversation that we're having that I wanted to throw out there. And I also wanted to mention, depending on the theoretical orientation in psychology, there are different pieces that contribute to an individual being like making progress in therapy. So there's one orientation I'm thinking of right now where social relationships are at the center. And you had mentioned that, Jules. Social relationships are really at the core, because if we think evolutionarily speaking, we've been in communities and we strive in communities. We're collective. That's where we have evolved from, and juggling that in a society that's more individualistic can perhaps for an individual be really challenging to navigate and make someone feel a little bit maybe isolated. For another person, maybe it's values. That's what makes them feel like they're having a fulfilling life, and values being the things in our lives that we find important. So coming back to that meaning and purpose conversation that we were having, maybe for that individual values, and there's a specific orientation that's all about working to build values for identifying values and helping individuals work towards those values. So let's say I value being successful in my career, and that's really important to me. Usually when someone might be unhappy, it might be that there's a values conflict, that they're engaging in behaviors that are moving them away from that goal of wanting to be successful in their career. So I think there's just so much heterogeneity around, what makes someone have good mental health, or is, what might make them feel like they're living a meaningful life or a life filled with, joy and those ranges of emotions you had mentioned.
We want to ask you many more questions, but we're wrapping up. And so, what? On one hand, we want to withhold judgment, but and I agree, right? Because as an educator, people change, and I know that people change because I see them change throughout, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. 16 weeks, however long our semesters are. But we humans do engage in behavior that may not be bad, but it's not helpful sometimes to ourselves and to those around us. Yeah. Why do we do that?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question, and one actually I've clients have asked me as well, like, why do I keep doing this to myself? Or why do I keep engaging in that type of behavior? And I think it really does stem from the notion that there are causes and there's effects. And that's the dynamic and interactions that are in the universe that we live in. And I think what comes to mind for me is, this idea of, it stems from a therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy. And the term is radical acceptance. And radical acceptance is, acceptance with your whole mind, body, and spirit, so your whole being. And when we explain radical acceptance, we talk about there are series of events that lead to each moment, that lead and contribute to each behavior. Just like right now, we're having this discussion, there are a series of events that led up to this conversation. And a really sort of strong example is if you think of someone biking. Let's say there's an individual biking down a hill, there aren't speed bumps, there aren't stop signs, there are no bike lanes, and there's a car coming and that car is speeding, and that car hits the biker. Should that have happened? And given the causes, that should have happened. And until we change those causes, that's not going to change the behavior or the effect or the outcome. So I think things that are unhelpful or ineffective happen because there are causes on an individual level as well as on a structural and systemic level. And we sometimes forget that there's society that we're embedded in, and there's structural challenges that we experience that affect the individual being able to move towards their goals or engage in behaviors that allow them to have a meaningful and purposeful life. And those examples might be like on an individual level, difficulties experiencing motivation, being able to get up and do things. On an individual level, it might be tendencies to experience certain personality traits that might predispose them to engage in certain behaviors.
Like interrupting.
What did you say?
Like interrupting.
There we go. On a structural level, things that come to mind are social supports. If we can't provide social supports and resources and therapy, access to care to people, then how are they going to be able to succeed? So I think it's multiple levels that are at play here that can contribute to some of those ineffective behaviors.
A distinction you made between happiness and contentment. So is one of your guiding lights that say a philosophy of contentment or a life of contentment? Is this something that you then try to envision for your clients or help them to see how they can be content with something or accept it or live with it in such a way that it's okay or something like that? Rather than, you don't have to be happy about it, but you can be content with it, right? Yeah. Something like that.
I think that acceptance piece is so important. And that's when I try to work with a lot of the clients that I work with on is it's so, there's so many things we as people, we have struggles accepting, and we kind of clench our fists and we go, no, I'm not going to accept that. And that keeps us really stuck. And I think that when we can sort of let go of that kind of tension against accepting, when we can try to embrace things that are difficult to accept, I think that can allow us to maybe not be the most happiest people in the world, but to find contentment in our life and perhaps maybe just being content is enough. And this finding joy, all those books you see out there about 10 ways to be the happiest person alive, maybe those are encouraging people to strive to things that are actually socially constructed and not attainable. And that's where we see the defeat, is striving to something that no one can perhaps ever reach. And so we're setting people up for that failure. Maybe it's something that is interesting to think about.
I think about the juxtaposition of categories, because it's, I just think in terms of, I can hear people saying, well, why be content? Because content is almost like you're settling for something when you could have done more and maybe be more challenged and unhappy in the process, but why not push yourself, right? And then in terms of from a psychologist or the non-judgment, there is some judgment when people are diagnosed as having a certain behavior or a certain disorder, right? So is somebody who is diagnosed, is that diagnosis stay with them? Do people break out of that category? How do clinicians work with categorizing people without limiting them? How can we be content first so that we can be happy?
So kind of the sort of the pros and cons of diagnosing, is that?
Right, because it seems to me that when it's helpful to be diagnosed, but at the same time it can be not helpful if my diagnosis is, if I identify with my diagnosis later. And I'm more than that. Each one of us is more than that.
Yeah, and that's, I think the question of the utility of diagnoses is a topic that's very popular right now. Is, you know, there's a lot of progress being made in trying to consider what are diagnoses doing and not doing for people, and how does that move people away and towards their goals. And there are different types of taxonomies that are being created that take more of a processes-oriented approach, which I think is a really interesting movement that's happening in the field right now. And I think you're absolutely right that for one individual, a diagnosis might be incredibly empowering. It might be an opportunity to take power back and control back in a situation that might feel like they have no control and that they've lost control. For another individual, it can be putting them, like you said, in that box and keeping them in that box, and can be really discouraging and can create a lot of stigma, which is a really commonly discussed term in our field as well, that especially recently has gained a lot of interest, which I think is very important. There's stigma in society, there's self-stigma as well. The processes approach, though, is really interesting. That's sort of maybe a synthesis here, you know, keeping diagnosis and the utility of it in mind, but also recognizing that diagnosis can box people in. Maybe being person-centered is the path that makes sense, meaning what is happening for that individual. Well, this person I just assessed, they have low mood most of the day, every day. They're experiencing difficulties with motivation. Their depression is, let's say, getting in the way of their appetite, their sleep. They're starting to isolate, you know, and disclosing on that person-centered, using that person-centered approach. These are the processes I'm noticing, and this is what I think could be useful for you. That might be more effective and allow for an individual to feel like they can attain their goals, because there are specific interventions for that specific process that's maybe not working in the way that that individual might want it to work. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does, the process.
And we have to end here because
Yes,
we're getting signs from our
From the
production crew
universe.
from the universe, right? Speaking of the universe, the last final question then is, do you think psychology, maybe clinical psychology in particular, can contribute to world peace?
It's a big question. Well, what is world peace? I think is maybe the place to start there. But yeah, I think so. I think psychology, there's a lot you can do with it because it's the study of human behavior. And I think the possibilities are definitely there. But a longer conversation that we probably don't have time for.
Let me add to that then, because we talked about contentment, right, and satisfaction. In German, the word for contentment or satisfaction is Zufriedenheit. And the etymological core of Zufriedenheit is Friede, which means peace. So to be at peace with oneself, right? It's kind of like contributing to world peace. If you can be at peace, if I can be at peace with myself, you know, I'm not going to go around doing bad things or you know, interrupting when I shouldn't interrupt.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta, and thank you for joining us today. Everybody, my name is Dr. Kim Diaz.
I'm Jules Simon.
This has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. Please join us next time.